every hour, every step of every way. We need you.
The application of man's responsibility. The question is frequently asked: how do you reconcile God's sovereignty and man's responsibility? Anyone who has been in church circles, particularly Baptists, has heard this question over and over. It keeps coming up, sometimes even from the same people, as they hope for an answer that is different from the one they heard before. The answer that is frequently given, much to the dismay of the questioner, is: they are not enemies. You only need to reconcile enemies, not friends. This is a very good answer. It is actually quite brilliant, but much like the brilliance of natural yogurt after a meal, it requires some context to be properly appreciated. This usually missing context is what I hope to flesh out in brief. It is a large topic that cannot be cleared up in one sitting, but we can at least come to terms with certain aspects of it. Today we looked at acting out man's responsibility in light of a sovereign God. Understanding factors. When I was in mathematics class in primary school, my teacher taught us how to find the factors of a given number. He did not explain why we needed to know that or what that particular skill could be used for. He simply taught it to us because the syllabus said so, and perhaps we could find use for it in future. Little did I know that the methodology he taught would be something that would come in handy later on in life as I began to learn more about how the world works and how to think of and understand it. I say this because in understanding the relationship between the two, God's sovereignty and man's responsibility, it is important to break down the two terms, not just by definition but also by factors. This would get us one step closer to digesting it. The table is set, the meal is served, grab your cutlery. Let us dig in. When we say God's sovereignty, we mean that God created and sustains all things. In Him we live and move and have our being. Acts 17:28a. We mean God has control over all events, from the movement of every single atom and molecule to that of the galaxies. Or who shut in the sea with doors when it burst from the womb, when I made the clouds its garment and thick darkness its swaddling band, and prescribed limits for it, and set bars and doors, and said, thus far you shall come and no further, and here shall your proud waves be stayed. Job 38, verse 8 to 11. This is what we mean. Not a God who is partially in control, not a God who is aloof or taken by surprise by anything, not a God who needs reminding of things as though he does not know it, a God who is sovereign. This is where the complication comes in, because we immediately think, if God can and does do all this, why should we do anything? Surely God does not need us. Why pray? Why act? Why try? Which brings us to man's responsibility. There is something required of man, something that must be done. The Bible makes this clear over and over again as commandments are given to us. You cannot command unless you expect some sort of action from the person commanded. The fact that God commands us to do something means that He requires something of us, and so when the time comes to judge, He will judge us based on what was required. The requirement is the standard. Only be strong and very courageous, being very careful to do all the law that Moses my servant commanded you. Do not turn from it to the right hand or to the left, that you may have good success wherever you go. This book of the law shall not depart from your mouth, but you shall meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do according to all that is written in it. For then you will make your way prosperous, and then you will have good success. Joshua 1, verse 7 and 8. You cannot miss the requirement. He has told you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you, but to do justice, and to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. Micah 6, verse 8. There is a requirement, there is a responsibility, and we must fulfill our duty. God does not need your help, He requires your worship. One of the major bones of contention in this is that of faith. Hebrews 11 verse 1 describes faith as the assurance of things hoped for and the conviction of things not seen. We either doubt that God is doing His part, how ironic, or we don't know what our part is, or doubt that what we are doing is enough. Both of these are problems of faith. It is ironic that a group of people who believe God is in control of all things would at the same time believe He has stopped doing His part in one particular situation. We think God keeps every single atom and molecule in the universe at work and playing its part, but He isn't exactly doing that in our particular situation. We lack the assurance of what we hope for and the conviction of the reality that is unseen. The other thing is that we do not know our part or that what we are doing is enough. I will get into examples shortly, but this is basically when we look at the thing we desire and are not sure what we need to do to make it happen, or that the efforts we are making are enough to achieve our intended result. This is one of the strangest ones of them all because it makes light of what the Bible says, and this is something Christians should not do. This should make sense through examples. We shall look at illness and exams. Illness. Illness is a tempting and trying time. It presents us with a situation we cannot control against an enemy we cannot see and having to trust information that is difficult to verify. Because of these three things, we easily end up asking God the question of his sovereignty and man's responsibility. We ask ourselves why we are in such a situation. If God is love, why would he do such a thing or allow it to happen? This is a complex question that cannot satisfactorily be answered in the few words I will pen down here, but we can at least embrace a quote by V. Raymond Edman: "Never doubt in the dark what God told you in the light." And this is where faith comes in. What we know to be true about a sovereign God means that his nature has not changed from situation to situation, and our faith is in that God and his character. This ties in with human responsibility in that I know God and his nature have not changed. He is just as in control of things now as he was when I thought things were rosy. And so, what do we do in light of this? In simplicity, we live healthy. We seek the counsel of doctors, we take the medicine, we do the exercise to the full extent possible, but more importantly, we have faith that God is using our efforts and a host of other factors that only he knows and controls in answer to our prayers. But we also live faithful to our calling as believers, dedicated to God's service and worship as we read our Bibles, pray, sing songs of worship, and live out the truth we are learning. Obedience does not go on hold just because we are sick. Human responsibility is not one-dimensional. It is not that we obey God in that one area so that God works in that one area. Much like God continues his work in all aspects, we too must act out multi-dimensional obedience. This is not a transaction with God for us to do one thing and God repays us with one thing we want. It is holistic obedience and service to God and all he commands, having faith that he will do what he says because in reality, he never stopped. The Christian believes that God will show his glory through their desire and through their situation as they live out multi-dimensional obedience. God's sovereignty and man's responsibility are friends working towards the same goal. They are not enemies. Exams. Exams present a similar dilemma. We get so focused on the single dimension of the problem at hand that everything else gets thrown out the window. All that matters is the studying that has to be done right now so that the exams are passed. A reasonable thought, but a carnal one. The exams may be difficult, but what is the guarantee that you will pass the exams? Is it you or God? Is your faith in him or is it in yourself? The horse is made ready for battle, but the victory belongs to the Lord. Proverbs 21 verse 31. More often than not, we despair because our faith is in ourselves and not in God. And on the flip side, we either do too much or we do too little. Too much in that all life goes on hold because of the exams. We cannot make time for God and church meetings. We cannot make time to minister to others and their needs even though we know about them. In fact, we close ourselves off to news from others so that we can focus on this one dimension of our lives, promising ourselves it is only for a moment. Some even going as far as to emulate LeBron James' famous Zero Dark 30, which basically shuts out everything else because this challenge ahead is all that matters. Too little, in that we do not do the work while expecting God to deliver. The horse is not ready for battle, and yet we expect God to deliver the victory. So what does human responsibility look like? We go in with our desire to pass the exams when they come and commit the desire to God, not just as a one-off request. We take full advantage of the opportunities God has provided through classes, tutorials, and study times, but we also remember that our one-dimensional obedience is not pleasing to God. We are not part-time salt and light that can go on vacation from our vocation because of exams. Do you have faith that God will honor the work you have diligently put in over the course of the study time so that you can sacrifice time for his work and his worship? Or do you think it is your effort that delivers the victory? The Christian believes that God will show his glory through their desire and through their situation as they live out multidimensional obedience. God's sovereignty and man's responsibility are friends working towards the same goal. They are not enemies. I can already feel the pushback as you groan. If I do not do this, then I will fail. I will be dealing with this in the next blog about the disciplines of man's responsibility, but for now I will take you back to Proverbs 21 verse 31. Who delivers the victory? Is it you or God? Putting everything else for the sake of studying is you making enemies out of friends, saying with your mouth what you do not believe with your heart. There is no salvation there. How often do we hide our lack of faith behind the desire to prepare? How often do we tell God his work has to wait while we pursue our own? How often do we take these friends and try to make enemies of them? Some closing thoughts. Human responsibility is acting as God requires in obedience to his written word and will. Our problem is that we like to limit God and his work to the single dimension of our situation, of our felt need, without care to full-fledged obedience to all God requires of us in every area of our lives at all times. So we love even when we are down. We serve when we are busy. We give even though we have little. We work even though we are tired. We forgive even when we are frustrated. In all this, having faith in God to watch over the individual dimensions of our lives. To put it another way, we love and serve God without worrying about our situation because God is in control of that, just as he always has been. Human responsibility begins when we appreciate that God does not need our help. Instead, he requires our worship regardless of the situation. You may not get what you initially wanted. This does not mean that you should immediately jump to saying, if it isn't your will. You don't have to preempt God's answer. Stop trying to do his work. Commit your desire to the Lord in full knowledge that God always answers prayer. You may not get what you initially wanted, but you will always get something more rewarding.
And when